Commission resumes. Ms. LaRue.
Thank you, Chair. I'm not sure if you'd like to start with swearing in Mr. White or if we should just do all the housekeeping on exhibit numbers and then commence.
It's probably sensible to do the housekeeping first.
Chair,
If you wanted me to do the other way around, I will.
Chair, I'm in your hands. We've provided you with the index of documents to be used. The new exhibits that have been provided to you include an index to the final statement, supplementary statement, and then an errata clarifications document.
So index wouldn't be an exhibit, would it?
Chair, I don't know. We will be referring to it. I'm not sure if you want it to be an exhibit or will.
So he will be quadruple B, will he?
Yes, Chair. I understood there was some talk of going AB, but if we want to do quadruple Bs.
I think if we introduce a new system, then we'll only cause
quadruple B.
Quadruple B1 is, how do I describe it?
Will be the index to the final statement of Gary White. Then, Chair, quadruple B2 will be the index to the supplementary statement. Quadruple B3 will be the errata and clarifications document to the final statement of Gary White. Quadruple B4 will then be the supplementary statement of Gary White. And quadruple B5 will be the statement of Constable Molatowagai.
How do you spell that?
Molatowagae.
So
Molatowagae. Correct. Then, Chair, the final statement of Mr. White has a number of annexures attached to it. The GW6 series was marked by my learned friend Mr. Chaskelson, and we did JJ178, which is Mr. White's statement, point 1 through to point 6 for the GW6 series. The other annexures to that, GW3, Mr. White's CV, the GW4 series and as well as the GW8 series that deal with the expert process, the engagement with the SAPs. Those haven't been exhibited, and I'm not sure if you'd like to continue the GW178 point.
I think it'd be sensible to do that.
9, 10.
As far as I can remember, in the statement I read that, are they not referred to?
They're referred to as
way?
Yes, they're referred to as GW6A or so.
So
Chair,
it'd be sensible to do that.
Right. So then, what we would need to do, because the 6 series takes up JJ178.1 to point 6. JJ178.7 would then be GW3, Mr. White's CV. JJ178.8 would then be the GW4 series. JJ178.9 would be GW8A. 178.10 would be GW8B. 178.11 would be GW9, and 178.12 would be GW10.
Those documents have already been so marked?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Is that the housekeeping over now?
That is the housekeeping, Chair.
You call the witness. Mr. White, would you please stand? Are you prepared to take the oath, or do you wish to affirm? Will you swear the evidence you will give before this commission will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Will you please raise your right hand and say, I swear so help me God?
I swear so help me God.
You may be seated. Thank you. Yes, Mr.
Mr. White, if we could start...
I'm sorry. I'm reminded that I must ask you your full names.
Apologies, Chair. My full name is Gary White. There are no middle names.
No middle name?
No.
All right, so we have your full names already. All right, thank you. Now that important point has been disposed of, you can proceed.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. White, could I ask you to turn to what we've just marked as J 178.7, GW3, your CV attached to your final statement?
I have it, Chair.
Could you briefly summarise for the Commission the positions that you held in the Police Service of Northern Ireland?
Mr. Chairman, I was a police officer in Northern Ireland for just over 30 years, joining in 1982 and retiring in April of 2012. Like everyone, a police officer in the United Kingdom, all police officers join at the lowest rank, at the rank of constable. So I served in every rank through that period, from constable right up through to, in the last year of my service, I was temporarily promoted to the rank of Assistant Chief Constable. During the course of those 30 years, I've been involved in a variety of different roles, ordinary uniform beat and patrol roles. I've been a police trainer. I have been a police prosecutor in court, a number of specialist functions, including policy departments. The vast majority of my career has been spent in operational roles, and the vast majority of that period was spent in and around the North and West Belfast area, considered to be one of the most difficult policing environments, certainly in Northern Ireland. I served in North and West Belfast in most ranks, including I spent a considerable period there as the district commander with overall responsibility for the area. And then I also spent quite a large part of my time in the role that I performed in the last 3 years of my service, which was as Chief Superintendent in charge of Operations Department. In that role, I had specialist responsibility for functions such as public order units, armed response units, close protection, but with particular responsibility for public order. North and West Belfast would be the area where we still would experience quite a lot of public disorder. So again, I spent a lot of time there.
Yes, thank you. I take it that's probably enough by way of a summary. And then when you've already handed in the CV, and he can confirm under oath that everything in it is correct.
Mr. White, could you then briefly describe for the Commission your current position and the type of work that you're currently engaged in since you've left the police service?
Mr. Chairman, I currently act as a consultant. I'm a joint owner of a small company in Belfast, but it effectively serves as an umbrella group, and then I would be contracted to various other organisations. So I'm a policing advisor to international non-governmental organisation called Safer World that are based in London. I provide specialist policing advice to them in relation to a range of projects that they undertake. I'm also a deployable civilian expert for the British government's stabilisation unit, and again I provide policing assistance to a range of products. And then within the unique group itself, we have been successful in winning a number of contracts relating to policing, including I designed and wrote a command course for the Malawi police in dealing with election security and issues around public order and command.
Mr. White, in your CV, I don't think we have managed to cover it. I just wanted to ask you to highlight your UN, your current advisory roles relating to the UN.
In February of this year, Chair, I was invited to a meeting of experts in Geneva looking at the UN basic principles and the use of firearms. That's an ongoing process that I hope to be involved in.
And then, Chair, Mr. White's academic qualifications and other training courses that he's done are set out in the CV.
There was one other point I thought might be relevant. In his reply to certain questions posed to him by the SABC, he spoke about his role in compiling some of the most recent policy documents in Northern Ireland. The revision of the one that he mentioned in his final statement, about which he was asked. He said something about that, so perhaps that to be important.
Yeah, Chair, I do intend to cover that in the course of my exam-in-chief. Mr. White, you've provided 3 statements to the Commission, which I need to get you to confirm under oath. But first, if we could just explain and set out on the record the status of the 3 documents you've prepared and the circumstances in which those have been provided to the Commission. The first is your provisional statement, WW2, dated the 18th of January 2013. Could you explain the status of that statement and how it came to be before the Commission?
Chair, that statement was prepared at the request of my legal team, and I understood that I stood on foot of a request from the Commission in relation to evidence I'd seen up to that point. The process that I went through in relation to presenting evidence to this Commission was, in the first instance, to review a hard drive which had been supplied to me by my legal team, as I understand had been supplied to them by the South African police. And basically, having interrogated that hard drive and made a judgment on the value of the information within, I then put that into my provisional statement and made certain, or drew certain conclusions from that. I stress again, I said in my provisional statement that it was in fact a provisional statement, and that to a large degree the views that I was expressing were provisional. I was somewhat wary of providing that statement because I was very conscious that I hadn't seen all the evidence, but I was responding to a time frame that I think was helpful to the Commission.
And Mr. White, do you rely on that statement before the Commission?
In effect, that statement has been superseded, Mr. Chairman, by my final statement.
Mr. White, with respect to
I understand that. Sorry to interrupt. I understand that everything that's still of importance in that preliminary statement is incorporated in the final statement, so we can read it there, as it were. Is that correct?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I think that my final statement effectively builds on my provisional statement because there's additional evidence, obviously, that I've been made aware of. I'm confident that I don't think that there's anything in my provisional statement that has changed dramatically in terms of my views.
Mr. White, with respect to your final statement, which is before the Commission as JJ178, there is a document that we have now marked as quadruple B3, the errata and clarifications document. Other than the changes set out on that document, you have no further changes to your final statement, correct?
That's correct, Mr. Chairman.
Chair, if we can then briefly look at the errata and clarifications document. The first 5 paragraphs are simple typographical corrections that Mr. White picked up in his final statement. Mr. White, could I ask you to then briefly explain to the Chair the other 3 clarifications that you set out in this document, clarifying your final statement?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Those issues are listed at paragraphs 6, 7 and 8, and I'll be guided by yourself. Do you want me to go through those one by one?
You'd better deal with paragraphs 6, 7, and 8 in some detail, because it may be important. It relates to really what you meant and the impressions created by some of the things you said, which you say were erroneous. So I think, in fairness to everybody, you should deal with that now.
Chairman, again, I'll be guided by yourself. Would you prefer me to read it word for word in the first instance and provide you an explanation, or would you just like me to give you a sort of an overall commentary in relation to that paragraph?
Overall commentary would be enough.
Okay, dealing with paragraph 6, then the issue was in relation to this terminology, if you like. Paragraph 6 deals with, I think, the terminology where I talked about the configuration of the wire after the movement of Nyala 6, and specifically states that the razor wire would, if anything, canalise protesters towards the informal settlement. The reason I used the word canalise was because I was directly quoting the word that Lieutenant Colonel Scott had used. I would have to say I wasn't familiar with the word, and I'm trying to be very sensitive to the fact that I'm in another part of the world, so I wasn't sure if that was a word that was in common usage in South Africa. And that's
common usage as far as I was aware either, but it's dangerous sometimes to adopt words that other people use if you're not quite sure how they intend them to be understood. But anyway, you can just clarify the point and we can proceed.
And that's a lesson for me, Mr. Chairman. So that was the reason that I used that particular word, but the intention that I was basically just simply trying to state was that, and I refer to this in some detail in my final statement, the original configuration of the wire was effectively an arc which seemed to be suggesting to people that they couldn't come towards the informal settlement. for a very good reason. I understand that Nyala 6 was moved, and I have no issue with the fact that it was moved, but it changed the configuration considerably. It seemed to me, therefore, that the position of the wire seemed to suggest to people that the police would have no objection to them walking to the outside of the wire, around sort of the edge of the wire, if you like. That's effectively the point that I was trying to make. I think it might have been suggested that some people might have interpreted I was saying that the police were almost saying to people that you must come this way, because ultimately that's where scene 1 happened. It couldn't be further from the truth. I was just simply saying that I think the reconfiguration of that wire, therefore, effectively was saying to people that clearly you couldn't come to the inside of the wire, breach the wire where the police had set up their neutral zone for the protection of their officers and the media. But the police had no objection or no difficulty to you walking around the outside of that wire, which seemed to be pointing towards the informal
So
settlement.
do I understand the point you're making to be this, that you weren't suggesting that that was the police's intention, that the people should go there? What you were suggesting and saying was that the objective effect of the change might have conveyed such a message to the strikers, even though that wasn't the intention of the police to convey that message. Is that an accurate summary of what you're saying?
Chairman, you've summed it up far better than I could. Exactly.
Then, Mr. White, the point that you clarify in paragraph 6, if you could summarise that for the Chair.
Yes, Chair. In my statement, I had made the point that, given the position of a number of the bodies, it would seem to me that there was no reasonable explanation as to how those people would have been there, other than the fact that they were shot at that particular point, and clearly were towards the back of the corral. I'm conscious of the comments that you, in particular, Chair, have made with regards to the fact that people may have been shot and retreated to those points. I absolutely accept that point. I would only say in response that in part I was relying on the fact that in Exhibit L, presentation slide 209, which shows arcs of fire, I assumed that might not have been a point that was being disputed. But again, I apologise for making the assumption, and I agree entirely with yourself that it's not provable that would be the case.
And then finally, Mr. White.
There is the other alternative that the deceased were in those positions at the time and might have been hit by a stray bullet fired from a long range.
I think that's absolutely a possibility, but on reflection, how I framed it in my first statement, I think might have been making a particular presumption. I'm absolutely open to the fact that I think that it is an open question. So I'm not saying that, nor do I think that this is the point that the Chair is making, that they were shot and they did move back to those points, but just simply that it's an open question, and certainly I don't know.
And then finally, Mr. White, the clarification set out at paragraph 8.
Yes, again, Mr. Chair, I'm grateful for you asking me to clarify this. And this is very much just an issue of misinterpretation from the point of view that I'm absolutely, totally convinced that this operation was set up in terms of the dispersal with the public order police going forward. It says that in all of the planning documents, and I make numerous references to that in my statement. However, in the plan that Lieutenant Colonel Scott provides, he then says that they will be backed up by a TRT line and then followed by a second line, which is the NIU/STF. My point in relation to this paragraph was that if the police were engaged, consistent with Lieutenant Colonel Scott's plan, that the POP police, the public order police, might retreat to their Nyalas, I then said, and then they would be confronted by not one but two lines of police, with the TRT being the front line. In other words, once the POP had moved away, then the TRT would be in the front line, followed by that's the point that I was making.
Thank you, Mr. White. If we can then just clarify for the record the status of the different annexes to your statement. Am I correct that GW3, your CV, and GW10, your responses to the Evans leaders' interrogatories, were documents that you produced?
That's correct, Mr. Chairman.
And you have no changes to those documents?
No, Mr. Chairman.
Then with respect to the GW4 series, particularly 4C and 4E, which are your response in identifying areas of agreement and disagreement and clarification with Mr. DeRover, the SAPS expert. Could you say something about the production of those annexures?
Chair, I worked on those documents in association with my legal team, and that was a process basically by Skype and telephone calls and exchange of emails where basically I was asked to comment on certain documents, make amendments to it and input into answers to the South African Police's legal team.
And then finally, there's the GW6 series attached to your final statement. Could you explain for the Chair your role in those documents?
Chair, I didn't have any role in compiling those documents. My legal team advised me that they were compiling those on the basis of factual objective evidence that they would present to me in order to help me understand the situation better, and from which they would invite me to draw my own conclusions.
Mr. White, if we then turn to your supplementary statement, which has been marked as quadruple B4. Chair, the purpose of the statement is set out page 1, paragraph 1.1.1, where Mr. White sets out the 4 reasons why he prepared the supplementary statement. Mr. White, do you have any changes to your supplementary statement that you'd like to make?
No, Mr. Chairman.
With respect to the supplementary statement, could you briefly explain for the Chair how you considered the evidence that forms the basis of the supplementary statement, what you considered, what you didn't?
Again, Chair, I was basically asked to consider new evidence which was sent to me in an electronic file. My legal team had helpfully ordered that into various folders, but in the first instance I was basically invited to review all of that evidence. However, they had indicated to me that this was not all of the additional evidence which had been submitted to the Commission since the submission of my formal statement, but it was an attempt to direct me towards the more salient points so that I could update my evidence to the Commission, because it's been some considerable time, obviously, since I submitted my final statement.
So, Mr. White, you have not looked at all evidence that came in since October 2013 in compiling your supplementary statement?
That would be correct, Mr. Chairman.
And, Chair, the index to the supplementary statement that we've now marked as quadruple B2 sets out essentially the key themes in Mr. White's final statement that he updates.
Please repeat the last sentence. I didn't hear.
Chair, I was just...
Edmund was putting a point to me.
Yes, Chair. I was just indicating that if you were to scan the index to the supplementary statement, which we've marked as quadruple B2, that highlights the key themes from Mr. White's final statement that he updates in the supplementary. I don't intend to take him through that. So, Mr. White, having now explained the status of your statements before the Commission, and with the obvious caveat that you've identified which annexures you did not have direct input into, could you affirm all of the statements and annexures that are before the Commission and that the opinions expressed therein are yours?
Absolutely, Chair. I have been provided with factual evidence by my legal team from which I have drawn my own conclusions.
Mr. White, if we could then move into your experience as a public order officer and commander. Chair, for the record, this is set out in part 1 of Mr. White's final statement. Mr. White, if we could briefly identify some of the characteristics of your public order policing experience. What experience have you had of policing large crowds, numbering in the hundreds or thousands?
Chairman, unfortunately, despite a relatively successful peace and political process in my country, we still experience large-scale public order. So although during the early part of my career, whilst the political conflict was ongoing in Northern Ireland, we also experienced large-scale public order. To a large extent, the hidden story of Northern Ireland is...
So when you say public order, I take it you mean public disorder.
Sorry, apologies, Chair. It's, I suppose, a police term. Public disorder is absolutely what I'm talking about.
Just to attempt to make sure I was following, I should imagine.
Apologies. Yes, absolutely, public disorder. So, one of the hidden stories, I suppose, from the international news in relation to Northern Ireland is the continuance of on-street disorder, which often will be very large scale, numbering quite frequently crowds in their hundreds and often crowds in their thousands, and also, as I say, very serious in terms of the level of violence that the two communities will direct towards each other and also direct towards the police.
Mr. White, could you give some detail with respect to the types of weapons that the crowds you policed would carry and use?
Basically running from a scale from the very bottom to the very top, Mr. Chairman, from what most police officers, I'm sure, experience during the course of their career in terms of stones and bricks and bottles, right up through to handheld weapons such as baseball bats, long metal poles, scaffolding poles, extending on up through to Molotov cocktails. We refer to them as petrol bombs at home in Northern Ireland. Single incidents in which there are literally hundreds and on occasions thousands of those that would be thrown. Moving on through to numerous instances of homemade types of munitions. We use the term of blast bombs in Northern Ireland, which might a term which might extend to anything from a very crude device, which might be a commercially bought firework, which has then been wrapped with nails or other types of shrapnel, to a more sophisticated blast bomb, which might be a piece of copper tubing with some type of black explosive powder inside, again packed with shrapnel. Shrapnel might be nuts and bolts, it might be metal shavings, it might on occasions be small pennies, which obviously create damage when they explode. Moving through again then to, on occasions, military grade hand grenades, and then also firearms, handheld firearms, AK-47s, and also then at the very upper scale, I have dealt with public disorder situations, apologies, Mr. Chairman, whereby we certainly have had intelligence to say that munitions such as RPG-7s have been present in the area. Now, that's not likely to be used by police on a shield line or on dealing with public disorder, but quite often the nature of these operations and the scale of these operations means that we bring a lot of police officers to a particular area. We're fortunate in Northern Ireland that we still have our traditional vehicle that we use would be an armoured Land Rover. So therefore the RPG-7 would clearly have been intended to target those. I stress that I'm actually talking about a relatively recent incident in the last number of years, which was policed out on the basis of intelligence, as opposed to the RPG-7 wasn't actually used.
Mr. White, you referred to a shield line. What is that?
A shield line would be a typical policing public order tactic where literally police officers are lined facing the crowd with the police officers on the front line having the protection of plastic shields.
Mr. White, have you policed crowds that were intent on confrontation with the police?
Well, I'm sure you can tell from my last answer, absolutely intent on confrontation with the police many, many, many times over many, many years.
Mr. White, could you briefly describe your experience with spontaneous or dynamic policing situations?
Chair, often in Northern Ireland our disorder would be related to what we call the marching season, where one of the two communities, one side has a particular tradition around parades and marching, and this causes tension. So the majority of the public disorder incidents that we deal with would be in relation to marches, and I could tell you that there is likely to be a large public disorder incident in the next couple of weeks in Northern Ireland. It will be on the 12th of July. It will be at Ardown in North Belfast, and I could also almost tell you exactly what time it's going to be. So I'm conscious of the fact...
Commemorate a battle at the end of the 17th century.
1690.
Yes.
I congratulate you on your knowledge of history, Mr. Chairman. So I'm very conscious of the fact that I've been asked the question around spontaneous incidents, but I'm setting the scene in the context that a lot of our public disorder incidents can be anticipated and will be in relation to those types of incidents which have actually been notified and the police have time to prepare for. However, additionally, we'll also have numerous examples of spontaneous public disorder that we need to respond to. Sometimes those might be relatively minor skirmishes, which might be able to be resolved by a small number of police resources being sent to the scene. quite often they tend to happen as a result of, and particularly in North and West Belfast, where, forgive my use of terminology, but the sectarian geography. Belfast is still a very segregated city. We still have a lot of what we call peace lines, perhaps a bit of an oxymoron, but these are large walls that are built between the two communities to keep the two communities, Catholic and Protestant, apart. I stress that they're built at the request of the communities as a form of protection as opposed to being imposed on communities by the state. However, the sectarian geography of particularly North Belfast is that it's effectively a patchwork quilt of small, very polarised communities, Catholic or Protestant, with the politics being Republican or Loyalist, living very close to each other, sometimes protected by peace lines, but sometimes because their main arterial routes, that's not possible to do. And quite often, spontaneous violence will erupt between two communities confronting each other, which the police then respond to. So I suppose the short answer to the question is, do we have experience of dealing with spontaneous incidents that flash like that? Unfortunately, yes, over many, many years.
Mr. White, do you have any experience in policing rural public disorder situations?
I have some experience in policing rural public disorder situations. As I've said earlier on in my evidence, the vast majority of my experience has been in and around the North Belfast area. But Northern Ireland's a small place, and it's one single police service that covers the whole country. So yes, I have an experience. Probably the most notable example would be an area about 40 miles from Belfast called Drumcree. It's a small rural town. It became very famous around the scene of a particularly contested parade, as I've been referring to. And this is where a parade marches from a rural town called Portadown out to this very small rural hamlet called Drumcree to attend a church service, and then it's supposed to come back around almost a circuitous route. The inward route, the return route, basically takes it through a Catholic nationalist area, and in and around the early 1990s it became very controversial. The parade was banned initially by the police, because the police had the authority to do that in those days. The situation has changed considerably since then. There's now a body called the Parades Commission who make these decisions. But that particular parade, over a number of 6, 7, 8 years, was probably the most controversial one that we were dealing with, which required police resources to attend that incident from all across the country over a number of years. And quite often that policing operation would last a number of weeks. Very rural setting, very open farmland type area where crowds were being contained by the use of razor wire and that type of thing. Similar to some extent, to a limited extent, I accept, to some of the images I saw in relation to the evidence that's currently before the Commission in relation to how razor wire was being used to barrier crowds, if you like.
Mr. White, I asked you about crowds intent on confrontation with the police, but could you get a little bit more specific about your experience in dealing with actual threats to the police?
Could you clarify, just for the purpose of the answer, are we talking about where people are threatening in terms of verbal, sort of making threats that they're suggesting they intend to carry out, or are we talking about threats in relation to the types of weaponry being used?
Mr. White, both. The way they verbally communicate threats to you, as well as if they take any action to actually threaten the police with weaponry.
I think, Chair, in relation to the first part of the question, it would be rare in a public disorder situation not to be threatened. It'd be a fairly regular thing. And whilst on occasions, that might be bravado by some people in the crowd, bear in mind the second part of the answer that I'll give, on occasions it's a very serious threat. I personally have had instances whereby in trying to negotiate with crowds, I've had people, I mentioned in a previous area, Northern Ireland's a small country, I have had people who might be standing 1 or 2 people behind the person I'm trying to negotiate with, not only telling me he knows where I live, but telling me where I live and telling me where my children go to school. And obviously there's a very serious implied threat within that. So in terms of threats, yes, absolutely, often and regularly. In terms of threats in relation to actually attempts to kill or injure police officers, I've alluded to some of this earlier on, but numerous occasions where we've actually faced gunfire. in addition to all of the other issues that I'm talking about, like Molotov cocktails, heavy masonry. And actually, it's interesting that a debate that goes on within the police service, or the police service that I worked in, around how the police respond to some of these threats. There's sometimes a frustration by more junior officers who therefore in public disorder situations are further forward and obviously on the front line, that they sometimes feel that some of the more senior officers, particularly people who would be in control rooms and not necessarily ever on the ground, obviously when we talk about gunfire, that indicates a very, very serious threat that needs to be responded to in a certain way. Blast bombs, similarly. But Molotov cocktails. However, what's interesting is that the police officers who are on the front line, will actually talk about the level of concern that they have, is what some people would talk about the lower end of violence, i.e. masonry and things like that. But, if someone can get close to you with a large block of concrete, if it's so large that they mightn't be able to strike you in the head with it because it's heavy to lift, but if that sort of thing was to hit your feet underneath your shield, you might never walk again. So, it's just interesting around how different officers dealing in different roles actually perceive the difference in threat. But with regards to threat at the higher end in terms of being in public order situations where, we've faced gunfire on numerous occasions, yes.
And Mr. White, specifically with respect to sharp-edged weapons?
There have been occasions when I've been involved in situations, yes, where crowds have been armed with sharp-edged weapons. I don't know that would necessarily read across to what referred to here as traditional weapons. We certainly don't have a tradition, I would have to say, of any type of spear. But I mean, knives, and also actually in terms of the parading tradition that I was talking about earlier on, a number of instances whereby some of those parades, one of the organisations that takes part in the parade is called the Orange Order. I'll not bore you with the details of the Orange Order, but how they dress, it's very traditional ceremonial type dresses. They'll have bowler hats, almost looks like a banker going to the city in London, with a bowler hat and a suit, and then they wear this, what they call a sash. But the people at the front of the parade will carry ceremonial swords. But it is a sword, and we've had instances whereby there's been disorder around parades where those ceremonial swords have been used to attack police officers on numerous occasions, but also then much more crude devices, baseball bats with nails hammered through them, pieces of metal that have been sharpened and then thrown at police officers. Sharp-edged weapons in terms of, I'm not sure, and I've seen a lot of security since I've come here to South Africa around people's homes, but we have security fences where you'll have a wall and then you'll have a device at the top which is sort of spikes which tumble. So even if someone was to climb up the wall and try and grab these spikes to try and get over, it's a series of individual pieces of a device which has got lots of spikes on it. So when you pull it, it tumbles and spins. So therefore you can't climb up on it. On a number of occasions where those have been removed from security fences and have actually been thrown from rooftops down at police lines. So again, large pieces of metal this side protruding in a number of at a number of angles.
Mr. White, with respect to your command in these operations, could you describe the command roles that you would have, as well as the number of police officers and units under your command?
As I said, sir, at the very beginning of my evidence, because I joined as a constable and worked my way through, so I've had experience in every single role, including being the police officer on the front line, holding a shield and right up through. Specifically in relation to command of these roles, of these types of operations, our command system, we base on a 3-stage system. We call it gold, silver and bronze. Gold would be strategic level. Silver would be tactical level. And bronze would be operational level. So typically, the gold commander will be far removed from the scene, perhaps in a command room sort of overviewing, because the role of the gold commander is to set the strategy, to resource the incident, to set the tactical parameters, and to set the style and tone. The silver commander, depending on the circumstances, might be at the scene, or again might be in a command room some way away from the scene, Often that would be the case if the command room has facilities such as CCTV, etc., etc., etc. The policy that we have says both of those roles, the person needs to be located where they basically can exercise that function of command. So it's not specific in relation to whether you should be at the scene or whether you should not. The bronze commander, then operational, will be a person on the ground in charge of resources. I have numerous experience in operating all three of those roles. We talk about these roles as or these positions as being role-related, not rank-related. So if I can explain, in a large-scale anticipated public disorder situation, such as, for example, the 12th of July, with all that's going to happen in Belfast, the gold commander will be the assistant chief constable, and the silver commander will probably be at the level of chief superintendent. However, if you had a relatively small football match that's going on somewhere on a different day, the gold commander might be the chief inspector, with the silver commander being an inspector, and so forth and so on. It's role-related, not rank-related, consistent with the nature of the operation. So therefore, I have been gold in relation to lots of quite serious public disorder incidents. I have been silver in relation to a lot of very serious public disorder incidents, and also I have been bronze. When I was the chief superintendent, the district commander for North and West Belfast, typically my role would have been a silver. Typically it would have been a silver, with the assistant chief constable for Belfast being the gold commander. In my last 3 years of service, I was the chief superintendent for operations department, as I explained earlier on. It is unusual, in fact I think it's unprecedented, that an officer of chief superintendent level would be on the ground performing the role of bronze commander. The role that I undertook, this head of operations department, was created on the day that I took the job. It didn't exist before, and I sort of say this advisedly. When that role was being created, I was particularly selected for the role. Because it was unprecedented for an officer of my rank to be on the ground, I made some inquiries as to what the view of the chief constable was around that, and he was very supportive. So I performed the role of bronze commander on a number of occasions as the chief superintendent of operations. I then gave evidence earlier on that in the last year of service, because of the sudden retirement of my boss, I was temporarily promoted to assistant chief constable. It is absolutely unprecedented that an officer of the rank of assistant chief constable would be on the ground as the bronze commander. So I basically didn't, in the first instance that we had a serious public disorder, anticipated public disorder situation, I got a phone call from the silver commander of that operation the next day, asking me to meet him for a cup of coffee, when he had said to me the chief had been with him on that night, and the chief had specifically requested that for the following event, which was coming up the following week, that he wanted me on the ground. So as assistant chief constable, I also performed the role of bronze commander on the ground, which was unusual in that I was an ACC as bronze commander. The silver commander for the operation was the chief superintendent, who I ranked, and then the gold commander would have also been an ACC. But I stress it's role-related, not rank-related, so therefore I was working under the authority of the silver commander.
Mr. Watt?
Before we move on, unless you're going to deal with this later in your evidence, in which case you don't have to answer it now, but you read enough of the material relating to what happened in Marikana to understand who was performing what function. Now, we had General Mpembe as the overall commander, and we had Brigadier Collitz as the operational commander. Now, would Brigadier Collitz have been the equivalent of bronze? Is that right?
I think if you would ask me to draw a comparison, if it's helpful, Mr. Chairman, I think Mr. Collitz is probably operating in the bronze role, Mr. Mpembe in the silver role, yeah. And then I would say General Mabumbo ultimately in the gold role. I have addressed this in my statement where I've said...
You said that she was in overall command, yeah. small o, small c, though she wasn't the overall commander, capital letters. That was the function performed by General Mpembe. So that's the point you're making from a different angle at this point.
Exactly. My view would be that General Mabumbo made some of the key, made the key decisions, and people responded to that. Therefore, my analysis of it was that she was in overall command. I understand the terminology that South African police use, and that General Mapembe was the overall commander with capital O and capital C, as you say, Chair.
Mr. White, what role have you played with respect to planning the policing of public order operations?
Particularly, well, in each of those roles, bronze, silver and gold, I'd have been involved in planning. I'd said earlier on in my last answer, gold sets the strategy, sets the strategic objectives, sets the style and tone of the policing operation and resources it. It's then up to the silver commander to develop the tactical plan consistent with those strategic objectives. That's our planning process. So as I said, I was the district commander in North and West Belfast for the best part of 5 years. So across all of those 5 years, the majority of the times for the serious incidents that we're focusing on at this moment in time, I would have been silver. So therefore, I would have been responsible for constructing the tactical plan. I didn't do that alone. That was a planning process involving a team, and depending on the nature of the operation, might have involved one planning meeting, might have involved numerous planning meetings with various amendments being made to the plan, consistent with the type of operation that we were dealing with and the type of threat that we were dealing with. But again, just to reiterate, gold, silver and bronze, involvement in planning at all of those levels, but particularly at the level of silver, which is around writing a tactical plan for numerous operations.
Mr. White, to complete the process as we understand it, what role have you played in briefing police members who will be deployed on an operation?
Every single operation that we plan for then requires to be briefed. You know, I think I alluded to this in my statement, but unfortunately I can never recall in my statement I make a quote. I apologize because I never can remember the source of this, but it goes something along the lines of, if the people at the front end don't know the strategy, then there is no strategy. So therefore, you know, briefing is extremely important. Those briefings, the types of briefings will vary depending on the nature of the operation, but often if we're talking about a large, complex and sophisticated operation, it would have been regular practice to have what we would call a pre-brief. So for example, the operation is happening on a Saturday. There might have been a pre-brief on the Thursday when we bring together all of the people who are going to be in command positions, all of the bronze commanders, and I should stress that it is unlikely in a large operation that we would have a single bronze commander. There are two types of bronze commanders. One is a geographic bronze, so they own a piece of territory, in other words, and responsible things that happen in that. The other one would be a functional bronze, so somebody who has a specialist responsibility. So it might be functional bronze for evidence gathering, might be a functional bronze around traffic issues, might be a functional bronze around communications or whatever it is. So all of those people would come to the pre-brief. In addition to that, what is referred to here as POPs, the public order teams. Our public order units are effectively a unit of around 24, 25 people. You have about 22, 23 constables. Sorry, apologies, the number's higher now. 22, 23 constables, 4 or 5 sergeants and 1 inspector. That's what we call a tactical support group, a TSG. Those are the people that routinely are involved in the sheet lines that I referred to earlier on. So at the pre-brief, the inspector of those units that are going to be on duty on the Saturday would all attend a pre-brief. The force lawyer would attend that, media and communications department would attend that. And then we'll also have then an operational briefing on the morning of the event, just before we go to do whatever it is that we're going to do. But basically, you know, no planned operation takes place without a proper briefing. If the operation is one that we anticipate you would be likely to have serious public disorder, and particularly where we anticipate the likelihood of higher levels of force by the police, it's good practice, and it would often happen that those briefings would be video recorded so that we have a record of what the officers were being told, not just in relation to their actual deployments, but sometimes the officers will complain about this because they get a bit fed up with it, but we go over all of the issues in relation to human rights, use of force, all of that, you know, because it's really important. Also, if the operation is as I've described, it would be good practice and fairly regular that we would invite the Human Rights Advisor to the Policing Board. The Policing Board in Northern Ireland is an independent organisation which was set up around holding police accountability. They employ a specialist human rights barrister to monitor Police Service Northern Ireland's compliance with the Human Rights Act. It would be regular practice that person would be invited along to the briefing. In fact, during the time that I was district commander, it would have been very regular practice that at that stage there were 2 human rights lawyers to the Policing Board, and both of them would have come along frequently to planning meetings, to briefings, and would have been present in the command room and sometimes even on the ground in operations. One of those lawyers was Keir Starmer, who subsequently became the Director of Public Prosecutions for England and Wales.
And Mr. White, with respect to briefing during what we call a dynamic or spontaneous policing event?
Briefing in those circumstances obviously will depend on what you're dealing with. The point being that, as a police commander, if I want people to do things, well, then I need to tell them what it is that I want them to do, and importantly, how I want them to do it. So, as I outlined earlier on, numerous examples or a lot of experience in dealing with spontaneous public disorder type situations. There you don't have the luxury of having a pre-brief 2 days before. You don't even have the luxury of having a brief potentially even before you go to the scene. But at some point, if I am the commander, I need to think about what it is that I'm trying to achieve, how I'm trying to achieve it, the things that I don't want to happen, the types of sort of tactics that I don't want the police to use and that I do want to use, and then have some means to communicate that to people. Whether we get onto the scene and say, for example, because typically our spontaneous public disorder will be as a result of the 2 communities clashing, as I described earlier on. So on the way to the scene, the instructions to the police officers will be Unit A and Unit B will basically dismount from their vehicles and face off people on the Catholic side of the equation, if you like, and Units D and E will do likewise on the Protestant side until we get the situation stabilised and we think then what we're going to do, and then by a process of ongoing communication, briefing the officers as to exactly what it is that you want them to do so that they can do what you want.
Mr. White, is your bronze commander and the head of your POPs team, are they part of the planning?
Absolutely. Planning, particularly for the large operations, will involve a number of people. There will be representatives from, as you say, the POPs team. They will come along. The bronze commanders absolutely will come along. Depending on the nature of the area, we might have some of our neighbourhood police community police officers come along, because they will be a valuable source of sort of community intelligence which feeds into the plan. We also rely heavily on what we call tactical advisors. So if it's a public order operation that you're planning for, we would ordinarily require the input of a public order TAC advisor. Public order TAC advisors in Police Service Northern Ireland are typically at the rank of constable or sergeant, but these are the officers whose full-time job is public order training. So they're specialist tactical advisors. They practice the tactics every day. So, although I have a lot of experience, I've been involved in helping to develop tactics, whatever, but I would still often sort of rely on their tactical expertise to advise me. The important thing is that either during the planning process or in a live operation, and I'll come back to that in a second, but in the planning process, when we sit down to discuss what it is that they're going to do, they will offer suggestions as to the tactics that might be appropriate. It is the role of the commander to decide what tactics that we're going to use, but effectively that person provides a menu. And we talk through the advantages and the disadvantages. I'm more than happy to give you an example of how sometimes I think the tactical advisors get it wrong, if you want me to, by way of explanation.
A short explanation you can give it, but if it's a long, I don't want long one.
I dealt with a planning situation in relation to a rural incident. It was a small rural town. They were dealing with a controversial parade which was likely to include a sit-down protest. So people opposing the parade were going to sit down in the middle of the road. I asked the question of the person. I wasn't actually involved in the planning at this stage. I was asked by the Assistant Chief Constable to almost perform a mentoring role. So this was a check-up. As a result of the outcome of this, I ended up involved in the planning process. So I asked him what he was going to do about this sit-down protest, and he said, we'll send people forward and we'll try and negotiate with the people and see whether or not we can get them to move. Okay, that's great, that's fine. What if that doesn't work? I've received advice from the tactical advisor that said, in terms of a continuum of force, the next least level of force would be to bring the water cannon in on diffuser mode. The water cannons that we have are very sophisticated pieces of equipment in relation to a jet of water to keep a crowd back. They can be set in what's called diffuser mode, where it creates effectively a very fine mist. So if you're involved in a sit-down protest, effectively the water basically pushes the oxygen out of the air, so you would cough and splutter, and then people would get up and walk away. So he said that this was his next tactic that he was going to use. And I said to him, you know, have you ever been in this town? I don't know if you could get a water cannon into that town. This is a small rural town. But I was thinking about, you know, the public perception of that, you know, reputation to the service and all of those things. And I made the point to him, tactical advisors give tactical advice. Commanders make command decisions. And it would be absolutely inappropriate in terms of raising the tensions to bring a water cannon into an event of that sort of nature. So tactical advisors are very important, but at the same time, they don't make the decision. Commanders make the decision. However, as part of the planning process, one of the things that we do is go through a range of options, and we look at what the best option is, and that's recorded, and the rationale for that. We also record the rationale as to why we have excluded. So in the example that I've just given you, the record would show that the tactical advisor suggested water cannon for very good reasons, and then we would record the reasons as to why that wasn't going to be the case. Tactical advisors would also be used in lifetime operations. As the bronze commander on the ground, I might have a tactical advisor with me, simply because, you know, you can't be everything, you know, jack of all trades. So when I'm dealing with even an operation that's planned, things don't always go according to plan. In a dynamic situation, you know, you have to be able to respond to that. So again, the TAC advisor might say to me, sir, this group have now moved across here. Perhaps if you thought about putting 2 units there, and if we brought the water cannon here. And I might say, that's a very good idea. That's great. That's exactly what we're going to do. Conversely, I might say, no, I don't want the water cannon brought forward because of such and such. So we would have a variety of people, including the force lawyer, including media and communications department, all involved in the planning process from the point of view that everyone has something to contribute to think about, you know, the various aspects of the plan.
Mr. White, have you had experience of multi-day events, a protest that continues over more than 24 hours?
Chair, similarly, lots of experience of that. Although I'm a retired police officer and I'm no longer obviously involved in this, but in the area that I've been referring to, Ardoyne in North Belfast, there was a parade that was stopped last year on the 12th of July, as a result of which there was large-scale violence. There has been a protest at the point that that parade stopped ever since, and we're now in the last week of June. There has been a protest camp established there, and there has been a parade every single day since that parade was stopped in protest. Some of the parades have resulted in further violence, but just as an example, so that is an incident which has been going on for nearly a year. Drumcree that I referred to before went on for normally a period of around 2 weeks at a time. An incident that I've referred to in my statement where police officers returned fire. The White Rock incident in 2005. Serious public disorder broke out on a Saturday afternoon at 3 p.m. as a result of an ongoing operation, and basically we were getting the situation calmed down about Thursday evening. So basically it had ran on for that period of time. So the short answer again is yes.
Mr. White, in your evidence this morning, you've described, with respect to planning and briefing, the paper trail and recording the decision-making. Could you give a sense to the Commission of your participation in these accountability frameworks that you have in Northern Ireland?
Chair, not just me, but I've heard lots of people quote all the time that the police service in Northern Ireland are probably the most overseen and accountable police service in the world. And maybe we're not, or they're not. I'm no longer away, apologies. Maybe they're not, but I'm sure they're amongst the most overseen and accountable police services in the world. So when we talk about the planning process, we're conscious of the fact that all of the decisions that we make might at some stage be challenged, and quite rightly so. At the end of the day, with the police service, with the emphasis being on service, providing a service to the public. So, but there are a range of accountability mechanisms that the Police Service of Northern Ireland respond to. The Policing Board I've already mentioned, the Police Ombudsman's Office, which I think would be a sister organisation to IPID here in South Africa, the Human Rights Commission, Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary, etc., etc., etc. And even on occasions I've been interviewed, sometimes at length, by the Health and Safety Executive, who have been basically brought in to examine the outcome of a particular operation because maybe police officers got hurt. And in planning for all of these operations, obviously, there's a huge issue around the duty of care that we have to our own people, our own officers who we ask to do these very, very difficult jobs. So in terms of accountability, and not least, of course, accountability to the courts. Again, lots of experience.
So, Mr. White, in light of all of that experience, of course, you've never policed in South Africa. So how do you believe that experience can be useful to the Commission?
Before you get there, can I just ask a question?
Of course.
Which, a matter that perhaps could be dealt with before you get to the point you're now dealing with. Most of the violence, or perhaps all the violence you've dealt with, or disorder you've dealt with in Northern Ireland, is, I take it, what is sectarian-based, is it?
Without doubt, Chair, the majority would be. However, quite often there would be violence sort of inter-community, if you like, as in within or intra-community, within a single community. Also experience of dealing with violence as a result of football, which would be widely known sort of within the UK.
The supporters of various football clubs might, after a particularly acrimonious football match, and perhaps a fair amount of liquor being consumed, there might be trouble. I can understand that. The reason that I'm asking this question is, as you will understand from what you've read, the disorder that arose in the case we're dealing with arose in an industrial context, in connection with what we call an unprotected strike. And although to some extent it appears although this may be a matter of controversy, there was a certain amount of antagonism directed towards the police because of the role they were playing. But they were effectively interposing themselves not between two sectarian factions or even two football club supporting factions, but between the strikers and the employer. Now, have you had any experience of dealing with that kind of disorder in Northern Ireland?
I mean, I've certainly policed industrial disputes, but I would state very quickly for the record, they've never sort of escalated into, anything other than maybe a skirmish in relation to violence, where, people are picketing outside, the premises of a factory or something, and there may be very low-level skirmishes. So I make that point very clearly. But I would say that often we are dealing with a situation where basically the police are engaging with a crowd who have a particular angst. Sometimes I think that the complicating factor for us, and this is sometimes my colleagues in the rest of the UK, I think would acknowledge, is that quite often we're stuck between two opposing factions that want to attack each other, whereas a lot of the disorder that they will deal with will be simply, around a crowd in opposition to the police. So we'll have this multifaceted thing where the crowd sort of want to have a go at each other. The police are in the middle trying to keep the crowds apart, and then now that the police are there, both sides will direct their attention towards the police. But certainly in relation to what I would call single identity protest, if you like, does that happen, and does it sometimes happen whereby you get a lot of violence? Yes, it does. The most again at home in the last couple of years, they've been dealing with a particularly difficult issue ongoing, which is referred to as the flag protest. Democratic vote at Belfast City Council was not to fly the Union Jack 365 days a year. This caused a huge problem within the unionist community. So the police have been dealing with an ongoing, very difficult situation, entirely just within the unionist community. It's nothing to do with the nationalist community. There's no sectarian strife as such. It's just between the police and the unionist community. They're annoyed, upset, and responding back against the state, if you like, and the police being the representation of the state.
Sorry, Mr. Rubin, wanted to get clarity on that before we moved on to your next point.
Of course, and Chair, the screen behind you is flickering and it's rather distracting. We're told that they need to turn it off but can only do that in the break. So I'm not sure if we could take our first break so we can deal with that.
I was proposing to take the first break at 10:30, but if it would...
Well, Mr. White, is the screen distracting you, or can you carry on for another 15 minutes?
It's not distracting me at all, Chair.
Okay.
Well, it's not distracting you either, Ms. LaRue, but
then,
you can carry on.
Then we'll carry on. Mr. White, all of this experience, of course, you've never policed an operation in South Africa. So could you explain to the Commission how you believe that experience would be of use to the Commission looking at the Marikana operation?
For the record, Chair, yeah, absolutely right. I haven't ever policed. In fact, this is the first time I've been in your country. So, no, I haven't policed protests in South Africa. Nor have I policed protests in any other country. Obviously, I've been an observer to protests in a number of countries, particularly in the UK, but not policed them as such. How, therefore, does my experience potentially offer some value to you, Chair, and your colleagues? In the first instance, when I received the hard drive and started to engage with this evidence, and one of the first things I did was look at the sort of the policy framework, I was actually struck by the commonalities in relation to a lot of the policy documents of the South African police, the legal framework and whatever, with regards to overall principles such as, in relation to the use of force, minimum force, promotion of concepts such as negotiation and facilitation of peaceful protest and all of that. So I was sort of struck by the commonality. The second issue, I suppose, is that if you look at my provisional statement and my final statement, those being the documents where I say, this is what I think, and I draw conclusions. The areas that I've tended to sort of draw things out of, I'm talking about things like intelligence, briefing, command and control, the planning process itself, and issues of accountability. So, it's not situationally specific as such. I'm wondering, does it matter whether or not you're dealing with a wide open space in sort of rural South Africa, or you're dealing with a built-up urban environment in the middle of Belfast or wherever it is, in relation to the issues that I talk about and I draw some conclusions from? Well, that would be for you to judge, Mr. Chairman, in relation to the value of my evidence as to whether or not it does have any value. But I do think, for the reasons I've said, it does.
Mr. White, if we could then deal with the question of the policy framework, and you mentioned you reviewed the documents. Chair, for the record, this is page 11, part 2 of Mr. White's statement. Mr. White, could you summarize both the exercise that you conducted, what you reviewed, and then what conclusions you reached overall? This is page 11, part 2 of your final statement.
Yes, Chair, as I said, that the initial part of this process was that my legal team supplied me with a hard drive which came through the post. I had a telephone conversation to confirm that it had got there, and then basically, to a large degree, I spent some time then sort of engaging with the contents of that. As I worked my way through, I identified certain policy documents, and those are listed at paragraph 2.2.2, including the Standing Order 262, the Public Order Police Policy Document on Crowd Management, a National Instruction of 2012, which I think at that stage was still in draft, in relation to crowd regulation management during public demonstrations, and a number of other documents, including the Use of Force Directive for the Public Order Police, which are all listed in section 2 of my statement.
Please stop taking photographs while we're sitting. The camera is making a noise. It's interfering with the concentration of everybody. I think enough photographs have been taken in any event. Please stop taking photographs now. You can take photographs during the adjournment if you wish. Please carry on, Mr. White.
Chair, I think in fairness to the photographer, I'm not sure if he heard you. It's just I wouldn't want him to...
I don't know if the photographer heard me. Did you hear me? Please stop taking photographs. It's very distracting and disturbing. It upsets our concentration. You can do so during the adjournment. Please carry on, Mr. White.
So basically, the documents that I've referred to are in paragraph 2.2.2. I list them and make some comments in relation to each of them. Do you want me to give?
Yes, and Mr. White, your overall conclusion as to the policies and standing order framework that governs policing and public order policing in particular in South Africa.
A number of brief points on that. First of all, I've already commented in relation to the commonality. And secondly, the fact that I think I've commented in my statement that I don't think that the policy framework of itself contributed to the tragic outcome of these events, and that I think that the policy framework differs slightly from the policy framework in the UK, and might be potentially enhanced in certain areas around decision-making models and frameworks and a number of sort of technical aspects. But overall, it seems to be a robust policy framework, which, as I say, when I read through, I was struck by the commonality with the policy framework that I would be used to engaging with.
While you're dealing with that, can I ask you something that flows from that? You talked about Standing Order General 262. Have you had an opportunity to study Standing Order, I think it's 251, which was produced as an exhibit fairly recently in the Commission, deals with the use of force, particular Standing Order 251 Part 3. I did ask those instructing you to draw that to your attention. I don't know if they had the opportunity to do so.
Chair, I do remember a conversation to that effect, so I would have to apologise and say that certainly I haven't read that document in detail since I've got here. I've read a lot of documents, further documents in detail since I've got here. In fairness to my legal team, I do recall a conversation around that, and it might have been set for homework, and if it's helpful, I'm more than happy to have a look at that during the break.
I would say to you was I'd be grateful if you look at it overnight, because there's some questions I'd like to ask you about the interrelation between that Standing Order and Standing Order 262. Obviously, I wasn't proposing to ask you those questions now. I want to know you'd read it. In view of what you've told me, I'd be grateful if you'd study that overnight. And if you're able to give us some assistance on the point that I've referred to tomorrow, you'll then be able to do so.
I'd be very happy to try.
It refers to particularly to the command to shoot in particular circumstances where you have a crowd of people who are approaching. There are some of them obviously more dangerous than others, and how that kind of situation is dealt with. And there are a number of issues that I'd be grateful if you could deal with in the course of your evidence. So it depends to some extent on the interrelation between Standing Order 251 and Part 3 and Standing Order 262. It also deals with the situation we have here, where the evidence is that as a number of people approach a police line, no order is given to shoot, but the individual policemen are given what's called, I'm not sure it's correctly, but it is called a discretion to fire, which is in some cases then followed by an order to cease fire. It was how that works. I can understand one person or two people being approached by an assailant having to defend themselves. But where you have 50 or 60 people who are being approached, all of them potentially targets for violence, how that situation is appropriately dealt with. But I'm not expecting you to deal with it now, but something I'd like to hear your views on tomorrow, if you're able to assist us.
More than happy to, Chair.
And Chair, I've asked my learned friends, the evidence leaders, to assist us with identifying the exhibit. Mr. White, if we can then, before we take the break at past, you have been asked, in your final statement, you refer to a document called Keeping the Peace. And if I could ask you to then turn to GW10, which we've marked this morning as JJJ 178.12. These are your responses to interrogatories directed to you by the SABC. If I could ask you to turn to that document. The SABC asked you the question, and Chair, it may just be the quickest way to do this is to read it into the record. Mr. White's reference and use of the report called Keeping the Peace requires clarification on his part. Having regard to the fact that this report has been decommissioned in 2011 following the London riots, it has been replaced by the accepted professional practice Chair, that's APP in the acronyms of the police, in the public order policing. Mr. White, could you, with reference to the answer that's set out in GW10, briefly explain to the Commission how you understand the status of keeping the peace and its content and how it relates to the APP documents as well?
Firstly, Chair, my apology in relation to my reference to keeping the peace as opposed to APP in my statement. How this situation came about was that when I first started to engage with the evidence, I had an informal conversation with a previous colleague just around police public order generally. This is my fault, not his, but certainly during that conversation had not been aware of a changing process. Keeping the Peace is a document, particularly the 2010 version, that I had an involvement in the development and writing of. A document that I was very familiar with, and therefore I engaged on the process of providing my provisional statement and subsequently my final statement on the basis of using that as a policy framework. It was only I was made aware by the SABC legal team relatively recently around this issue of APP, and then I have to say I was horrified and I went back to check it. I actually took the liberty of speaking to the police college themselves and having an email back from them clarifying the position, which actually the email informs the response in red. So in brief points, basically, it's to say this, that it wasn't as a result of the 2011 riots that Keeping the Peace was decommissioned in order to move to APP. APP is effectively a sort of a reducing bureaucracy process. If you look at the document Keeping the Peace, and I actually have it here, at the back there's a list of references, and you'll see the list of references is quite extensive around various other ACPO documents, Association of Chief Police Officers. The whole idea about APP was basically to try and condense the amount of doctrine that's out there. Therefore, in what its relationship with Keeping the Peace is that to a large extent, the majority of the information in Keeping the Peace has moved across under APP. Now, as a learning organisation, it was written in 2010, at the very beginning of 2011, so of course certain things have changed. So there are some changes to what's in APP as opposed to Keeping the Peace, and that will be natural. APP was introduced to the police service from, I think, and I'm working from memory here, I certainly wouldn't want to mislead anyone, from around, I think, October 2012, but it wasn't actually made available to the public. You can now go on and look at it on the website, but that wasn't until the latter part of 2013, after I had submitted my formal statement. But again, I'm not trying to use that as an excuse. I just wasn't aware. However,
sorry, a couple of questions I'd like to ask you about. So you want to finish what you're saying?
Sorry, and the last point is basically that the email from the police college, which informed my response to this question, basically, clarifies the position that there is nothing that I've said in relation to Keeping the Peace which APP has now changed in terms of they've had to dramatically overhaul this policy because it wasn't fit for purpose or whatever. I'm absolutely confident of that fact, and also if it's required and if it's helpful to you, Mr. Chairman, I have made a query with the College of Police, and I'm sure they could write to you personally to give you assurance of that.
Well, I suppose the practical way to do it, if APP is available on the web, we could download it, and if necessary, extract could be made exhibits if some of the parties wish to do that, or we ourselves, on studying it, think it's necessary. The Keeping the Peace document, is that also available on the web?
Yes, my understanding is still available.
So one could compare the documents to see if there are, or if it's suggested that there are material changes. But if the doctrine in Keeping the Peace is still the current doctrine in APP, well then nothing turns on this particular issue. We are interested, obviously, in what we would describe as world best practice in this context. And if you, as an expert in the field, are of the view that Keeping the Peace was an approximation to world best practice when it was produced, and APP is now an acceptable statement of what one could describe as world best practice, that would suffice for our purposes, I would think. I don't know how you wish to respond to that.
Chair, I think it's up to you to satisfy yourself as to whether or not it's world's best practice. I'm absolutely convinced that both keeping the peace and APP, because it has been largely informed by keeping the peace, absolutely represents, very, very good practice. I'll let others decide where it sits in terms of world practice, but I'm absolutely confident it is very, very good practice in relation to dealing with crowds and the types of issues that we're talking about.
Chair, for your assistance, keeping the peace is GW2 to Mr. White's final statement. We have provided the URL where we can access APP. We'll also, we can prepare a printout for the Commission and provide that to you tomorrow.
That would actually be helpful. There's some people who can read these things on the computer screen. And other people with slightly different background have some difficulty. I'm one of those. So I prefer a hard copy if I'm not being unduly demanding.
Mr. White, with respect to the comparisons between keeping the peace and APP, you've done that exercise, have you not, where you compare the content of keeping the peace to APP?
That's correct, Your Worship. Since this matter was brought to my attention, and obviously I wanted to ensure that I at least satisfied myself before I try to satisfy yourself. So yes, I have actually created a document myself where I've gone through the bits of keeping the peace that I make reference to within this statement, and then, as far as possible, I've done a read across to APP. And I'm satisfied, but I appreciate that's for other people to judge, that the central tenements of my evidence, based on keeping the peace, these concepts are reflected, if not word for word, which they are on occasions, then very close to it, because, as I said, part of the process of APP was to try and sort of reduce bureaucracy, and therefore there might be a short and sharper version of how certain principles are laid out.
And Chair, for your assistance, the majority of Mr. White's reliance on keeping the peace is in part 2 of his final statement.
Understand. Would this be an appropriate stage for us to take the short adjournment?
Yes, Chair.
We'll adjourn for 15 minutes. The exhibit to which I referred is in the Triple Z series, in relation to Standing Order 151.
Chair, it's Triple Z8.
Sorry, 251. It's Triple Z8. It's Standing Order General 251, Part 3. That's the.
Thank you, Chair.
That's the document to which I referred.
Can I just say something that the extract that was given to us didn't. It wasn't the entire standing order. We were given part of it only. We've asked for the entire document, and that's not come through as yet. And we would rather prefer to have the entire document than just a part of it, for our purposes and for the purposes of Mr. White to comment.
Chair, I'm sure we'll ask the SABC legal team. I'm sure we'll be able to get the complete document.
Yeah, the parts that I read, which I was interested to hear discussed in the context of the comparison with 262, are contained in Triple Z8, which is an exhibit before us. But we don't know what preceded it, and we don't know what the current status is of that standing order. I assume it's still standing, as it were, but that's a matter the police will be able to help us on. But I'm more interested in the principles contained in both documents and how they interrelate to each other. Anyway, we'll take the 15-minute adjournment starting now.